Hello there, kia ora, and welcome to this week's Omnibus edition. It's actually been a relatively short week. With Scrutiny Week on, there hasn't been a huge amount of new shocking things going on, and the Prime Minister's out of the country, and it was a short week because of Matariki. So yeah, it's just a short week in terms of putting content together. But we did take a look at a poll that looks at something a little different instead of who people would vote for, who they think is going to be better at organising stuff and managing things like the economy and crime. And we took a look at Chris Bishop's plan to take back some power from local government if he doesn't like what they're doing. Sure, that sounds really democratic. Speaking of local government, we also released the trailer this week for Fabricating Consent, which will be here in the Omnibus as well, because I want as many people to watch it as possible. But also, if you haven't already, jump over to my Substack and have a read of the latest article. It's out now, available for everyone. In it, I tell you about some of the stories I've heard doing this research from local elected members on just how scary their job can be sometimes. There's a lot of really creepy stuff that happens, and looking into how things like hate speech laws, which is something that they've all asked for, is probably not going to happen, and they're trying to get the balance right. But you can find that linked in the description or linked in the page. It's on my link tree somewhere. So yeah, go give that a check out as well. It's kind of a peripheral piece to go with the documentary. There's a few of those happening actually with the written pieces, so maybe go and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. In the meantime, feel free to sit down and enjoy this week's Omnibus. Like the video if you haven't already, or subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Yeah, enjoy. Hello there, kia ora. I'm starting to suspect, just a little bit, that maybe the coalition don't like to let people make their own decisions. On the surface level, there's been actions like forcing kids to not be able to have their cell phones at school, or telling communities that their concerns about their kids' safety aren't all important around speed limit changes by schools, telling the disabled community and those who live and work with them that their needs aren't important, loosening gun laws despite opposition from the police and public, getting rid of smoke-free laws despite opposition from the health officials and the public, cutbacks to hospital builds around the country, again despite public feedback and issues from the health professionals, cancelling pay equity to pay landlord tax cuts despite that being really unpopular, and changes to health and safety and workers' rights despite opposition from worker rights groups. But there is a fascinating nanny state attitude that seems to be popping up towards local government as well. This government seems to think that the only votes that are important are the ones that people gave them specifically at the last general election. And we can see that with how they keep targeting local government and changes, which means that the decisions made at a local level are overridden by central government, showing that as far as they're concerned, the public's vote in local elections isn't worth the paper it's written on. Take the latest announcement. The Minister for Housing can step in and alter a council's decision around housing if he doesn't agree with the outcome, saying that the decisions from councils he doesn't like stop economic growth. We've seen from their fast-track process that past decisions from councils, iwi, and environmental protection groups, and more, are what they consider a limit to economic growth, which means in this instance, he could be looking at stopping local decisions around climate change mitigation made by local authorities based on feedback and outreach that they do in their communities and expert advice on their communities of interest. We saw the overwhelming majority of submissions and a whole bunch of councils involved with this around opposing the referenda on Māori wards, which included Canterbury Regional Council, who have 2 spots put aside for Ngāi Tahu under the Ngāi Tahu Representation Act 2022 to ensure mana whenua representation in the decision-making processes that the council undertakes. But despite local decision-making processes in place, overwhelming advice from those involved and experts on representation and the treaty, the government still forced it through, forcing expensive referenda onto a bunch of councils this year. They forced councils to take back water infrastructure and costs and then vilified councils for having to increase rates to cover the costs that they were forced to take on, and then removed elements of the Local Government Act around well-being provisions for communities, because they saw this as a nice to have. They saw it as wasteful. The well-being of communities is wasteful, so they overruled it. And the RSB could also be used to push these kind of nanny state changes, because it can be retrospective, especially since it's designed to focus on the needs of businesses over the needs of communities and completely ignores the treaty and is based around the standard of quote-unquote good lawmaking put forward by David Seymour, seen here with former party president and convicted child sex offender Tim Shargo, who this week had his lawyer argue it was unfair to say he'd sexually offended against children since only one victim was under the age of 16 at the time. Principles, huh? And the excuse they seem to use every time is, we have a mandate, this is what the people voted for. But people also vote for local decisions to be made locally for their local councils and local authorities to focus on their homes and set priorities of their communities. By overriding local decision-making processes because of what one bunch of right-wing politicians think is important, no matter the expense it has on people's lives, it shows a disdain for the voters who didn't choose to do exactly what the government wants to do. And that's dangerous. But it is another reminder that this year's local body elections are so important to get involved in. We need as many people to vote as possible for candidates who are able to stand up to changes that the government is forcing that remove local representation, ignore local needs, and tries to undo local communities so that their donors can build whatever cash cows they like in the name of economic growth. Hello there, kia ora. One of the simplest tricks I've come across from dodgy politicians trying to manipulate voters and narratives around costs is to take really complicated and scary sounding things and oversimplify them, losing nuance and, misleading followers. A great example of that is actually around infrastructure costs, like building crossings or speed bumps, the sort of activity that the former Minister of Transport used to conflate and make everything safety related sound scary. And a number of local body politicians around the country use the same tactic to try and sway voters as we see rates increase. Take this post, which showed up on the Waipa Residents and Ratepayers page, about the shocking cost of a single raised crossing outside one of Hamilton's busiest pedestrian access points near a main arterial route and schools. The post is originally from disinformation peddling Andrew Bidder. Yeah, so that should already be a bit of a red flag. After all, the executives of the Hamilton Residents and Ratepayers Association, the one that made headlines a couple of years ago for issuing pseudo-law execution writs for sitting councillors over 15-minute cities, they emailed me a couple of weeks ago to point out that they consider him deranged. And he's teamed up with Liz Gunn, making videos about trying to save the country. He wrote an 18-page novel about taking councils back from quote-unquote woke indoctrination by flooding the zone and winning all the elections. He went on Reality Check Radio to talk about that and then turned around on this particular thread and asked for sources when I pointed out that that's what he'd done. It was kind of weird. His followers said that I was getting all emotional. Apparently that's an insult, and I'm not a Cyberman. I don't find my emotions insulting. Anyway, he is kind of right in that $950,000 does seem like a lot to pay for a single raised pedestrian crossing. That's why the actual cost of this whole thing is $750,000 and it's not a raised crossing at all. I mean, the number he used was actually the price of a house nearby that he used to show the value of $950,000. And if people had read more than the first paragraph in the post, they would have seen that he actually does say further down the line that the cost is $750,000. But, why would you do that? This thing isn't going to cost what he's told them it's going to cost. It's going to be 200 grand less than that, and there's like a 5% variance in expected costs. So it's at the most, it will cost $750,000. But, facts, who needs them? Anyway, it does raise a complicated question that the common sense thinkers in this group who support these kind of candidates struggle with. Not why does somebody in the Waipa care about the cost of a crossing in Hamilton that they're not paying for, but is being pushed by someone who is running his own local Waipa ticket, so wanting people there to see a specific spin. No, they're asking why does it cost so much, which, does, I guess, seem fair when you think it's $200,000 more than it's actually going to be. Anyway, they will argue things like inflation's only at 2.5%. I mean, Andrew did that himself. By the way, he doesn't mind me making fun of him. He actually said he's feeling special when I do that. Anyway, he said 2.5% inflation rate. So why does this cost so much more than it used to? So I guess we could take a look at that. I mean, the Consumer Price Index, which is inflation on what average consumers purchase, like food, power, rents, that's at 2.5%. But every sector has a different inflation rate based on issues which are impacting that sector directly. Like the strength of the economy or the constraints of supply. The cost of labor and inflation rates are Well, they're kind of timey-wimey. It's a measure of past costs given a stamp in time, so it's more a guide for tracking changes than a definitive "this is what things should cost" statement. But, we can dive in a little bit deeper on that. If we take a look at the CPI in 2021, just as the war in Ukraine hit and COVID was going to sort of just start making its self felt around the rest of the world, well, our inflation rate was just over 3%. But for the infrastructure sector, it was almost 6%. The highest that our CPI got was in the past 6 years, 7.3% in 2022. And the infrastructure sector has got up to 12% at the same time. But here's the kicker. In 2019, building and infrastructure materials actually kept going up in costs due to supply chain constraints, strong demand internationally, rising labor costs for production, and a limited domestic production ability that we've got here. And then COVID hit, which impacted China first. The world's largest producer and exporter of the resources needed for a lot of infrastructure projects, and one of the world's largest investors in infrastructure, which meant that while our domestic CPI rate at the time was just 1.7%, the inflation rate for the infrastructure industry by the end of 2019 was 41%. And those prices don't often reduce because most of the factors causing the increases still exist. Inflation is about how quickly prices increase, but the last time that there was a decrease over the last 6 years, in fact, the only time there was a decrease over the last 6 years in prices, was at the end of 2024. And now we have US tariffs coming into play. It's really hard to predict what we're going to be seeing over the next sort of 12 to 24 months in terms of inflation within the sector directly. But one estimate has around 2.8% this year, 2.4% next year, to lower CPI rates in this country for everybody else. But again, tariffs, so who actually knows what's going to happen there? Anyway, building materials alone saw a 5 to 6% increase in costs in 2022, with an 11% increase on material costs. The cost of international air transport went up 6.6% in June 2024. And sometimes we use that to bring in some of the smaller bits of technology that might be needed for these infrastructure projects. We actually import quite a bit of material for those infrastructure projects. Machinery and technology, for example, they come from the United States and China. And for roading projects, we import 100% of all of our bitumen, which means that we have to plan for current projects using stockpiles that were paid for under the higher inflation rate. So we're still dealing with costs under previous rates, and those costs hang around for a little bit. And, the sector faced labour shortages as well over the past half a decade, which drives up labour costs. In 2024, Nick Leggett, the chief executive of Infrastructure New Zealand, pointed out one of their reports, I think it was, that we need to work more than double the current rates of projects over the next 30 years to meet a 100-year deficit in investment on infrastructure. And the infrastructure industry is actually less financially efficient than other sectors because there's a low return on equity and total assets and surpluses on employee costs than you'd find in something like wider construction, which means less players in the field, which means less competition to drive costs down because there's already no room for movement there. And according to AP News, events like Cyclone Gabriel and the Christchurch quake has led to an increase in scrutiny around enhancements for infrastructure projects, which increases the costs. And all of those constraints, they lead to increased delivery costs as projects are prioritized and resources are distributed. Before that, there's actually a lot of work that goes into making sure a change like putting in a crossing is fit for purpose, like working out exactly what sort of crossing it needs to be. Waka Kotahi has 11 different options for people. They're in this weird little chart. It's all hand-drawn. It's kind of strange. But you've got to identify which one is going to be best for the specific needs of the new crossing. And council can't know which options are going to be the best 100% until the local school finished their entrance redesign, which was happening at the same time. They're going with the advice of experts, so it's not going to be a raised crossing because it's too close to other connection points. And if Andrew had been at the briefing on the topic, he might have known that. But he wasn't. Then before you make changes to the road, engineers and experts need to ensure the location will work, look at what safety features will be required, identifying and sourcing the right materials, planning for proper drainage and accessibility, traffic and pedestrian management, site excavation, road surface grading, base prep, formwork, paving and surfacing, curb modifications, signage safety inspections and sign-offs. They all take time because making a road isn't like making instant pudding that sets really fast, and the time costs money. Experts, resources, safety features for those working on it and those around it. It all costs. So to build a crossing is never as simple as just piling some asphalt and we are still dealing with the aftermath of COVID responses, the Ukraine war, US export policy and tariffs and their long-term impacts on supply chains. Oh, and you know what? We're currently tanking the economy, making our dollar weaker next to our trading partners, meaning these things cost us more. The fact is, building this stuff costs a shitload more than it did 6 years ago, and no local councillor or politician in the country is going to be able to change that. And any hopeful councillor at this local body election promising otherwise, well, they're just wrong. It would be like you walking into Macca's and saying, hey, when I was a teenager, Big Macs cost $2.50, and sure, they may now be 4 times that price, but I don't see how that happened, and I don't think it's my problem. Now, no one likes that these things cost so much. No one enjoys seeing their rates bill go up, but councils only have a finite income level and limited levers on how to raise funds. Most people realize this, and the only people who are really misleading voters on this kind of topic are doing it because they want to scare voters into thinking that they are the bastion of fiscal responsibility. That or they're just plain stupid and don't understand what it is that they're saying. Could be either option sometimes. Hey, kia ora. I get that it must suck being the leader of a country where not only can you not get the respect of the voters, but also your own coalition deputies. I suspect that's actually why Christopher Luxon likes to jet off overseas as much as possible. The mental health breaks, where a former CEO who wasn't used to people telling him that he was wrong can relax while other people make him feel like a big deal. I think it's called self-care. But it doesn't change the fact that things aren't going so great for him here, even when his party tried to claim a win, like the announcement GDP went up 0.8% in the last quarter, which is good in isolation, but we're still down on where we were a year ago. The polls over the past month keep saying the same thing. National is struggling, which is weird because it's usually the support parties who end up suffering under a coalition. But this shows how much influence voters think the largest party in terms of the coalition really has. And then there was the Ipsos poll this week. Ipsos don't poll asking who people would vote for, they ask what the issues are impacting you and who you think would do a better deal fixing them. And in that poll, Labour came out on top for the majority of issues New Zealanders identified, and made gains in other areas that National came out on top, showing a general disdain for the current coalition and a general belief that they're not tackling those issues that we need them to tackle, like the cost of living. We were promised a laser focus. Instead, we got, we're bringing down interest rates, which aren't set by the government and have little immediate outcomes for renters. Meanwhile, as Jordan points out here in this very handy graph, the price of butter has skyrocketed, and that's just one item. Groceries keep going up, same as rents, rates, and power. In fact, looking at the most recent data sets out there, we can see some trends which shed some light on why this government is seen to be failing New Zealanders. Like this one, which shows GDP and income per capita in a steady decline since the coalition took power, and now at rates not seen since during COVID lockdowns and supply chain issues. Just as they cancelled pay equity claims and after delivering the lowest minimum wage increases in generations and delivered tax cuts for the wealthy and landlords and tobacco companies. Or this one showing the unemployment rate skyrocketing, next to this one showing the number of advertised jobs at the second lowest that they've been since the global financial crisis, the lowest again being during COVID. While we see headlines about harsher sanctions for people on benefits because they won't get off their asses and go and find one of those jobs that don't exist. Or this graph that shows the massive reduction in residential housing builds to the lowest point since the global financial crisis, while we see rising homeless numbers due to government policies, stories of people fleeing domestic violence being refused emergency housing, and cancelled builds from Kāinga Ora. Or even this graph on immigration, which shows net migration at the lowest level since COVID and the global financial crisis. And the data says the same thing over and over. The policies and priorities of the coalition government do not make the lives of ordinary New Zealanders better. They make the quality of life for many far, far worse. So much so that they're looking to leave the country to get away from it. And the polls aren't the only ones who see this. On a recent trip to Shanghai to woo fossil fuel investors, Shane Jones was told point blank, investors in those industries don't think the coalition will be back in power next election, So there's no real point in doing the work here to try and strip mine our resources just yet. And a first-term government being so unpopular, being seen as so weak on so many issues, and seen as a bad prospect internationally just halfway through its term, that's unprecedented. And I'm sure things will change for them when they, keep doing the same things, targeting the same vulnerable people, making life harder for the average Kiwi over and over again, because that's what they seem to think works. Because their bank accounts and the bank accounts of their donors, they look fine. This week on This Week's The News, groups demanding local control from councils say spank me harder coalition daddy. Why have a working public health system when it's easier to pay someone else to do it? A mysterious spate of heart attacks hits Tauranga, and they're pests in a half shell. All that and more on This Week's The News. Hello there, kia ora, I'm Paul, and this was the episode that was foretold by Nostradamus. Matariki celebrations were held over the Mutu this week as the constellation came into view, marking the Māori New Year. As the country's most recent holiday added to official calendars, it's quickly been adopted nationwide as a way of celebrating what makes Aotearoa unique. Unless you're the Prime Minister, who was not only out of the country for the event, but didn't even acknowledge it on his social media feeds. Said Luxon, seen here with another person who hates being called Winnie the Pooh. Acting Prime Minister David Seymour, seen here with someone he considered the highest calibre of staff, has been making headlines once again for creating targets for his fan base by comparing Christchurch council staff to Russia's Vladimir Putin. Seymour claims that the staff have been bullying Mayor Phil Major into opposing his regulatory standards bill, which South Island leaders have described as an assault and the latest step in a continual erosion of local democracy. Said the acting Prime Minister, unless they agree with me specifically, they're clearly wrong, and that makes them the dictator. This week, the government announced 212 Kāinga Ora projects, totalling 3,479 public houses, will not be going ahead due to what they are calling financial stability issues. Those issues are, of course, how it impacts landlord tax cuts and tobacco company kickbacks. Recent data sets out of the country's main urban centres are showing an exponential rise in homelessness. MSD data shows an exponential drop in emergency housing grants and increase in benefit sanctions. Said the Minister of Housing, Chris Bishop, seen here left hanging after trying to initiate a high five with media. When asked if this was related, "Oh, look over there, I think I saw a triceratops," before ducking down behind his podium and pretending no one could see him. Associate Health Minister David Seymour, seen here with an argument as to why selling sleeping pills over the counter might be a bad idea, has announced this week changes which will allow for melatonin to eventually be sold over the counter and magic mushrooms to be available by prescription. Said the minister, these changes are based on science and data. And well, that was actually a novel idea for us to try that way to create policy. I wouldn't get too excited. It's not like we're legalizing weed, regulating and looking into how you can use that as a future income stream. What this is an acknowledgement that for many Kiwis the horrors persist, and so do I. And sometimes that stops people getting a good night's sleep. The government has announced plans to scrap the 5-yearly census, instead getting data from government sources like MSD and IRD. Said the minister in charge of the census, Dr. Shane Reti, seen here performing his version of Weird Al Yankovic's Like a Surgeon. Our voters told us they didn't want to answer woke questions about gender identity, while we used the census-specific data to make changes like funding allocations for hospitals, local governance, and set maps for elections. We can't see how a few men who melt down over the idea of being asked their gender identity could be more right. Housing Minister Chris Bishop, seen here impersonating Emperor Palpatine when he says, "Good, let the hate flow through you," has announced this week new overriding powers on local government plans if he feels their choices are going to limit what he calls economic growth. It's a move being championed by organisations like Hobson's Pledge, who have said, "We've always maintained that there should be one person, one vote. And if that person is Chris Bishop, as long as he's not Maori, we're fine with negating everyone else's vote." Labour MP Deborah Russell, seen here finding out her electorate has one of the highest anti-vaccine populations in the country, has apologised for swearing in a scrutiny week hearing with Acting Prime Minister David Seymour. In response to Seymour's opening remarks, Russell was heard saying, "For fuck's sake." National's Ryan Hamilton raised a point of order of the topic, saying he's fine with angry mobs threatening to execute his co-workers and joining Destiny Church during their enough is enough period, but a swear is a step too far. Said Russell afterwards, "The comment was unparliamentary. I should have clarified that this was for the sake of fuck and that there was an apostrophe involved." The Health Minister, Simeon Brown, seen here asking why medical staff, why they're wearing funny pyjamas at work and if their job is really that important if they get to wear pyjamas at work, has announced plans for Te Whatu Ora to give private hospitals 10-year contracts to deal with minor surgery waiting lists in a move called privatisation. I meant a clear signal to the private sector. Said Labour's health spokesperson, Dr. Aisha Viral, this sends a clear signal that privatisation will become a part of the normal arrangements in New Zealand. And as an infectious disease expert, I can recognise this infectious disease a mile off. To which Minister Brown said, well, yeah, how else will our investors make even more money off sick people? King Charles III, seen here wondering if there's any more spoils of colonisation he could add to the photo because he's not sure the message is really coming through, is facing the wrath of racists all over the country by once again calling the country Aotearoa in his Matariki message to the country. Issued on Friday morning, the King wished all the people of Aotearoa, New Zealand an enjoyable holiday, while in Tauranga 4 heart attacks and 3 strokes were reported to media as old white folks screamed and wailed at the Māorification of the country from behind police safety barriers. Associate Minister of Energy Shane Jones, seen here showing the minimum serving size he's willing to show up for from lobbyists and how he reacts if he shows up and that's smaller than promised, has vowed to restart the oil and gas industry, despite opposition from local groups, a lack of new findings over the past 2 decades, and international investors refusing to commit over concerns the coalition will lose the next election. Said Jones, how am I meant to score free feeds from these industries at unscheduled meetings, wink wink, if we don't have anything to offer? And finally, the Bay of Plenty Regional Council is updating its plan to tackle invasive pest species in the region, having added turtle species to the list. Introduced turtles can completely alter the ecosystem if they are released into the wild, eating small fish, plants, freshwater crayfish and ducklings, and can displace wetland birds by taking over their nesting sites. While turtles can start as small as a 50-cent piece, over their 50-year lifespan they can grow into the size of a dinner plate. So the new plan makes it compulsory to ensure turtles are housed in secure areas to ensure they don't escape. Said a spokesperson for the Regional Council, we know the area is actually one that Shane Jones has his eyes on for fast-track projects, which we expect to lead to an increase in toxic sludge being released into waterways. And we all know what happens when turtles get covered in toxic sludge, and frankly our insurance won't cover a ninja turtle outbreak in the area. Right, that's this week's The News. Thanks again for all the support this week. Live long, prosper, be one with the Force, and we'll catch you all next week.
One recent one said, we know who you really are. You'll be found out soon and we're going to make it all public.
If you ever thought local body politics was boring, then you're thinking exactly what they need you to.
They get you into groups and then they try and direct you, and the easiest way is to become ungovernable.
Groups who rely on disinformation, pseudo-law, algorithms, and fear.
Some have sent death threats and one said he wanted to drag me down the street behind his truck.
To push hate, racism, and harm, dressed up as concern and patriotism.
I think it would be fair to say that there was no institution anywhere in New Zealand that worked to stop that more than Groundswell.
For years, they've been working to create networks, manipulate media, and assimilate into communities because
if we get the numbers, we can start to exert more control.
They see the country as broken because they consider empathy a weakness.
These are the same people who brought us the jab that's killing people and causing carnage. These people.
Now with the election imminent, they're organising, mobilising and manipulating the public.
And I think with the right people in council, with a team of people that work for you to work for us.
Crossing over from a fantasy world to force ours to look more like theirs.
You've become the fiction, because their world can only work on the fiction.
Join me as we explore the webs of the groups trying to manipulate voters this local body election.
And finally, getting rid of the racial discrimination that has crept into council politics. I think that's something that people would love to vote for.
Join me as we discover what happens when AstroTurfs go local, when they've fabricated consent. Hey, thanks for checking out this week's Omnibus. There's only one more of these to go until I take a bit of a break. I'm going to take about 3 weeks off at the start of July. So I guess enjoy the content while you can. I've got some stuff pre-scheduled for when I'm away, but it's definitely not going to be in an Omnibus edition at the same time because who knows what will happen while I'm away. It's crazy enough to know what's going to happen by the end of today. Anyway, enjoy. I hope you have a fantastic day. Live long, prosper, be one with the Force, and I'll catch you guys all next time. Hey, thanks for checking out today's video. Make sure you like, share, subscribe so you get more updates as we go along. We deal with these guys for the rest of the year.